It's UofL Today on 93.9 The Ville. Here's your host, Mark Hebert.
And welcome to UofL Today with Mark Hebert on 93.9 The Ville. If you haven't been paying attention, this is the show about all things UofL, where we talk to faculty members, students, staff members about all the great stuff going on at the University of Louisville. So hopefully you'll stick around for the next half hour or so and learn something. You've heard the news stories about people trying to take squirrels, birds, and other animals into buildings or on airplanes, claiming they are service or emotional support animals. So what are the issues and laws on animal accommodations for people with disabilities versus an emotional support animal? Laura Rothstein is professor of law, and Brian Bigelow is the Title IX and ADA coordinator at the University of Louisville, and they are here to discuss these fast-paced issues that keep popping up in the news. Brian, good to see you. Laura, good to see you too. Welcome.
Thanks.
All right, so we heard this story, I think everybody heard it, about this woman who tried to bring a squirrel on an airplane and claimed it was her support animal, right? Is that the gist of the story?
That's the gist of the story.
All right, so what was wrong with that?
Well, for starters, it probably is pretty disruptive to the other passengers, and because squirrels are wild animals and they do bite. But I think it was an example of what we've been seeing more and more of in public places, people bringing animals, sometimes, usually they're dogs, but more often rodents, birds, potbelly pigs, parrots, all kinds of peacocks. There was a peacock on a plane, and trying to claim that they should be entitled to bring that animal as either an emotional support animal or a service animal. So I think it's made the public more aware that this is going on. I wrote an article that was just published with a long title about puppets, parrots, puppies, and pigs about this issue because my area that I write in is disability discrimination. And there's more and more interest and awareness of animal accommodations. And I have a dog, and I like dogs, and I like animals, and he provides me a lot of comfort when I'm around him, but it doesn't mean he should be able to go to every restaurant, every place that I go.
Right. Well, Brian Bigelow, you're the ADA coordinator on UofL's campus and Title IX. You handle those issues. So, from time to time, we're walking across campus or over the Student Activity Center. You see a student with a dog, a service dog there, and I assume that's legal. It's perfectly fine. They're supposed to have those folks there. The dog's allowed in anywhere. So, what's the difference between that student and someone who just wants to bring their parakeet into the classroom or something like that?
Okay. Well, a service animal is very specifically defined in the ADA regulations. It has to be, first of all, either a dog or a miniature horse. And
a miniature horse?
Yes. And,
I did not know that.
Well, and I've never
I haven't seen one on campus.
Of all states, you would figure Kentucky would be the state you would find a miniature horse in. But Laura has some numbers on that. There are very few on college campuses nationwide. But they are one of the animals that is recognized as a trainable service animal. And a service animal must be trained, although under Kentucky law, dogs that are in training to become service animals have the same protections as a service animal that is trained under federal law. The difference between that and an emotional support animal is an emotional support animal is not necessarily trained to perform any tasks. It offers its handler comfort and support by its presence, but it doesn't perform specific tasks that mitigate the effects of a person's disability.
They're cats.
Yes.
They're cats.
Cats can be emotional support animals. And the big difference is the license that a handler has to bring the animal with it, as you said. And a service animal is essentially viewed as any other disability mitigation device, whether it's a wheelchair or a prosthetic,
walker, whatever. Yeah.
Certainly, and because it is performing a task on an ongoing basis, or it's available to perform that task on an ongoing basis.
And campuses are particularly interesting. I've done a lot of a focus on campus issues because we have housing, we have employment, we have unique activities such as football games and basketball games, and we have a museum on our campus, and we have health clinics and so on. So service animals are allowed under the ADA into places of public accommodation. But where there might be additional animals that would be allowed beyond, that would be emotional support animals, would be in housing. And that's where you might be able to bring your cat, if you can verify, have documentation that it provides emotional support into housing and even in employment. But then you may not be able to walk it across campus. So that's where a lot of the confusion comes in about what animals, what law applies, what settings, what do they have to be able to do.
Talking with Laura Rothstein and Brian Bigelow from the University of Louisville. Laura is a law professor. Brian Bigelow is the ADA coordinator and Title IX coordinator at the University of Louisville. Brian, you were going to chime in there on something. What were you going to say?
I was going to address the issue of policy, university policy concerning ESAs, emotional support animals. There is some confusion, I think, amongst students, faculty, and staff as to how to respond to either the presence of an animal that is or purports to be a service animal and as distinct from an ESA. And it raises unique challenges in different settings, whether it's stadium security, they may be the first person that encounters the service animal once the person steps on UofL's campus. It might be a very fleeting interaction, but it's important that they respond appropriately to that. And for ESAs, I think it's important to emphasize that the rights of an ESA to be present on campus are severely circumscribed. Students who have a disability-related need to have an ESA in housing can obtain permission to have one by requesting, as any student would request, an accommodation through the Disability Resource Center. Once the need is documented, the animal can.
Well, let me ask you both this. Again, we're talking to Laura Rothstein, Brian Bigelow from the University of Louisville. We're talking about service animals versus emotional support animals, and what are the legal ramifications. So, if we're looking at someone who is bringing a cat to a classroom, or let's talk about in general, bring it into a restaurant, anywhere in. Anywhere out in
cat can be excluded. A cat does not qualify as a service animal under either the ADA or
it has
state
to be a
law.
dog or miniature horse.
Dog or miniature horse.
That's it.
And it's not performing a task.
It doesn't mean the restaurant can't allow it, but they don't have to.
Okay. All right. Well, let's go back to campus then. When you have more restrictive setting and rules that just about on campus. So say someone brings a cat into a classroom, and they say, "This is my emotional support." And should somebody raise the issue if I'm sitting next to this person, I've got an allergy? Should I raise the issue?
It could be excluded because emotional support animals do not have the same rights to accompany their handlers every place that a service animal would. And at the university.
But again, should I say something if I'm allergic to cats or something?
Well, let's take it to a dog because the cat can be excluded because it's a cat.
Okay.
Cat's not a dog. So, but the dog. Someone brings the emotional support dog to you. You may say, "Well, I have an allergy." If it's emotional support, then you don't have to allow it at all. But they say, no, this is my service animal. And this is where I do think there's some challenges. But someone has severe allergies. Someone has phobias. The regulations talk about, having an interactive process where you just work it out. I think we're kind of in a problem area where it's not always that easy to work out. Large classrooms, someone comes in the first day, and so on. But that's what's contemplated. And I've kind of batted around with others and with Brian about, even though you're not required to, would it be permissible? Could it be encouraged that people provide advance notice if they're bringing them to a classroom or to a clinic?
At the start of the semester or whatever.
Yeah, and you can't require it.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Final thoughts on this? It's become an interesting issue, certainly in the news. Final thoughts from both of you on this issue of service animals versus emotional support animals?
Well, it's definitely an area that's evolving largely because the different settings have different rules. Again, the housing versus the campus, and of course, completely different worlds like the Air Carriers Act, where the law is developing at a much quicker pace.
Right.
It will be interesting to see where the regulations end up in terms of whether certain types of species are not considered ESAs and so forth. It's a developing area and it's very interesting.
And if you're interested in this subject, Laura, where can they find? What's your book called, and how can they find it?
Well, it's not a book; it's an article. You can link to it on my website at University of Louisville at the law school, and there's a link to the citation for the article.
Okay, that's Laura Rothstein, Brian Bigelow. Thanks for being on the show, as always. Suicide is the 10th leading cause of death in the United States, and for every suicide, there are 10 who attempt suicide. Laura Frey is an assistant professor in the Kent School of Social Work doing research on suicide, and in particular, how those considering suicide talk about it with their loved ones. Laura, welcome back. Good to have you back on the show.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
All right, you did this study, a little bit of research on how people tell or don't tell their relatives, loved ones, etc., about their suicidal thoughts, basically, is what you're talking about, right?
Yeah,
So
absolutely.
tell us about that study.
Yeah, certainly. So we know that disclosure is the most straightforward way to find if someone's at risk of suicide. And oftentimes we ask family members or gatekeepers to watch for warning signs, but really we also want them to feel safe to share with us. And historically, disclosure or communication around suicide has been measured with have they told anyone or how many people have they told. And what we wanted to know was really the depth of that disclosure. So how much are they sharing about the experience? Not just that they attempted, but how many times have they attempted? Why did they attempt? Why were they feeling suicidal during that time? And so we developed a measure to try to capture that.
So this study was on people that have attempted suicide.
So it was a mixture. It was people who've attempted and people who've had thoughts of suicide.
I'm talking about it. Okay. All right. And what'd you find? What'd you figure out?
Yeah. So we. So really, this was around creating this measure, and we found kind of a promising way to measure that. There's several different topics around suicide disclosure. I've mentioned a couple, like why were they feeling suicidal, but also where, how did they attempt, how many times have they felt suicidal in their life. And we've actually found that having whenever you share more about your suicidal experience, it was actually linked to more positive or helpful family reactions, which then in turn led to less severe depression symptoms, feeling more like you belong with your family, and feeling like you're less of a burden.
So there's a role here for the family, is what you're trying
absolutely.
to say.
Yeah.
As we're talking about that.
Yeah.
You mentioned in your notes and your study, you talked about ideation a lot, suicidal ideation. What is that? What are we talking about?
Yeah, so ideation is basically just the clinical term for thoughts of suicide. So it could range anywhere from, I wonder if I would be better off, to I want to attempt suicide. I'm thinking about that. I'm planning. I'm preparing. So there's a wide range of how thoughts can fluctuate. But yeah, ideation is just referring to thoughts.
Okay. And so these people that are having thoughts of suicide or have attempted suicide, how often do they talk to, and how deep are the discussions with their loved ones? I know you're going to say, well, it's complicated. It's for different people. But, I mean, in general, when you go look at the statistics and the numbers and the ability to try and measure that, what kind of – is there any baseline that you say, well, the average person who attempts suicide may say, in passing to two different relatives before they try. Is there anything like that you can?
So I can't give you a number. What I will say is we know that certainly people talk about suicide in different ways. So sometimes they'll maybe test the waters and say, you all would be better off without me, or don't worry, I won't be around much longer. And those are kind of subtle disclosures. And we're hoping that family members will ask, what do you mean by that? I'm worried about you. And sometimes it's straight up to, I'm feeling like I'm not safe. I might hurt myself. So it can really fluctuate. But we know that if somebody discloses to somebody and they have a bad reaction, they're unlikely to tell somebody again. Oftentimes they'll have the report of, I'm just never going to tell next time I'm suicidal.
I feel shut down.
Absolutely.
Do you think from your experience that suicide, attempted suicides, and thoughts of suicide are underreported in the United States? Or do you think people are pretty good about reporting it?
It's absolutely underreported. And a lot of that is because of the stigma associated with it. A lot of times we think of, reasons for suicide are mental illness. There's something wrong with this person. And that's not the case. It could be a mental health diagnosis or mental health condition that's causing this, but it could also be a lot of situational factors. In June, the CDC released a report where they showed that roughly 54% of people who had died by suicide didn't have a known mental health condition. More likely, it was things like relationship loss, a recent crisis, a life stressor. So those situational factors can really impact suicide as well.
So it was not a situation where this has been a long-term leading up to suicide. This is something that may have just happened last week, and all of a sudden you drop into depression, and within a week you're gone.
It could be, or it could be even there's something that's happened that's really made somebody feel ostracized from society, that they don't have anybody they can go to for help.
Gotcha. We're talking again with Laura Frey from the Kent School of Social Work. I want to talk to you about another research project you were working on involving sex trafficking victims and suicide. Tell us about that one.
Yeah, absolutely. So we surveyed youth experiencing homelessness here in Kentuckiana. So there were some counties here in Louisville Metro as well as across the river in Indiana. And roughly 41% of those had experienced sex trafficking in their lifetime. And out of the youth that we surveyed, 53% had experienced suicide ideation, so those thoughts we talked about. And of those, over 3/4, so 84%, had actually attempted suicide. So we're seeing high rates of suicidality among those that have experienced sex trafficking.
Wow. And how many kids total? Well, I'm calling them kids, young adults.
Youth, yeah, it ranged anywhere from 12 to 25. So, but we surveyed 128 youth.
Okay, between Louisville and Southern Indiana, basically.
Correct. Yeah.
Wow. And of those, 3/4 of them, more than 3/4, had thoughts of suicide, right? What are those stats again that you had?
Yeah, so I rattled them off pretty quickly. So a little over half had experienced ideation, and of those who had ideation,
they tried.
3/4 had actually attempted.
I gotcha.
Yeah.
So you're talking about a quarter or a third, if my math is anywhere near correct, of those that you talked to, of those youth that you talked to, had tried to commit suicide or tried to.
They'd attempted,
Attempted suicide.
Absolutely.
Okay. And I just used the word that I'm not supposed to use. I said commit suicide. Why don't we use the word commit? Why do we not say that? What's the...
Yeah, so the National Action